Hello and welcome to the Film Brain podcast, and it's a video edition because, using my conjuring magic, I have brought on a doctor of my own.
Boo. Hello, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
I'm alright, thank you. I'm alright. I'm pleased to talk about Doctor Strange and his multiverses of madnesses.
Yes, the latest Marvel movie, because apparently this podcast is now entirely devoted to talking about comic book movies for an hour.
How long did we talk about Wonder Woman again?
We did talk for about 2 hours that I managed to shorten down to about 90 minutes. I listened again to that podcast recently. It was so many memories came flooding back.
All of them immensely positive.
Well, at least we can say that this one is a better comic book movie than that one was.
Yep. That's the short. That's the too long didn't read. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I will start off with a plot synopsis. This is going to probably be a little bit challenging. So, Doctor Strange, played once again by Benedict Cumberbatch, has been having some very weird dreams lately of himself trying to rescue a teenage girl, and he's also dealing with the fact that his love Christine, played by Rachel McAdams, is marrying another man. Shortly after that wedding, Strange witnesses that same teenage girl, America Chavez, played by Xochitl Gomez, being attacked in the streets of New York. He soon realises that those dreams are actually visions of an alternate dimension in the multiverse, and realises that someone or something is pursuing America for her powers because she has the ability to go across the multiverse and dive between different dimensions. So Strange turns to Wanda, played by Elizabeth Olsen, for help. And that's the amount of plot synopsis I can get in, which is roughly 15 to 20 minutes into the movie before even remotely treading into spoilers. So before we do that, what is the very quick expanded non-spoiler thoughts from you?
I enjoyed it. It's always moving. It's one of those films that almost feels like a road movie, but in a very strange sense. No pun intended, apologies.
See, I was going to keep doing the strange puns.
I've stolen your magical thunder. Literally always on the go, pretty much. The exposition, of which there is quite a bit, especially early on, is always delivered almost sort of on the move or between something. You're never sitting there going, oh yeah, all right, get on with it. There's always something interesting happening for your 2 hours, which does give the slightly weird thing of you watch it for 2 hours and you come out thinking, if somebody told me that was 3 hours, I'd have believed it, because it sort of felt like there was so much in it. Do you know what I mean? Not in a bad way, as in like, ooh, it took forever or something, but, just because of the sort of density of it, really. Doctor Strange is a bit more likeable this time round, but he's still kind of, I don't know, a bit of a rude smart-ass who's always right, which is his character, to be fair, and he's got some sort of more rounded edges this time. His love interest from the first film is apparently around and was still a thing, despite having not really been mentioned or been a thing for literally years.
Yeah.
So it was odd to see that come back again all of a sudden. Oh no, this is the big important.
I feel like there's a lot of the original Doctor Strange that has suddenly popped back around in this movie that has never been brought up in the 6 years since that movie came out.
6 years? Oh! I thought it was 4 for some reason.
Yeah, it came out in 2016, which is a frightening thought.
There are whole children who sort of were barely born when that came out who are now watching this, probably. Oh my God. But not in the cinema. It's too scary. We can't really mention Wanda without spoilers. And America Chavez, the Xochitl Gomez character, she's very likeable, very, very positive screen presence, but less of a character and more of a sort of MacGuffin with narrator overtones. She's kind of there to dump plot and be dragged from one place to another. That's pretty much it.
See, I had very similar thoughts on the movie. I enjoyed it, and I thought it was very energetic. I quite enjoyed Sam Raimi's direction in particular, but it is a movie that has a lot of stuff in it. A lot of stuff, and I think sometimes to its own detriment. It does feel like a very crowded movie and it felt strangely uneven to me. When I get critical about Marvel movies, people will go, oh, you hate them, and sometimes when I get very praising of Marvel movies, go, oh, you're just a Marvel shill. But really, I'm just... I tend to run hot and cold with Marvel stuff. There's some things in the movie that I'm not really a huge fan of, but there is a lot of stuff that I did quite enjoy. I think the story is the kind of thing that kind of tripped me up a bit with this movie. I do think on a story level it's very uneven and suffers from a consequence of trying to do too much stuff. You know, that's a really annoying Ewan McGregor advert where he keeps talking about stuff, like for Expedia or whoever it is. Stuff. There's so much stuff, and we love stuff. That kind of kept going through my head throughout the entire movie. Like, there is a lot of stuff in this movie, but maybe too much stuff, as it were.
The pace of it almost reminded me of Star Trek Into Darkness, where it's kind of, woof, all this stuff happening, and then you get to the end, you're like, oh. But it doesn't suffer from the same thing of when I got to the end of Star Trek Into Darkness, I started to think about it and thought, that was rubbish. Nothing made any sense. Everything was just running through it. They cured death. Oh, awful. There's nothing like that. You don't get to the end and go, oh, man. You were just literally keeping up the pace of the action, so I didn't think about it. No, it's more positive than that. I pretty much completely agree with you, to be honest. It does feel overstuffed. It needed a little bit of room to breathe in places, perhaps. And you end up, because it's always flying from one crazy thing to another crazy thing, you're never bored by any stretch, but equally... It's hard to sort of have any real sort of emotional resonance when you're just constantly going, oh my God, more stuff.
Yeah, it's the kind of movie that, like I said, I really enjoyed while I was watching it, but also I was aware in the back of my mind there were certain things that I went, I'm not sure about that, and then going back over it, I go, no, I'm really not sure about that stuff. I suppose that is a good way of navigating into spoilers.
Yes, I think absolutely. Yeah, because as you correctly say, about 15 minutes in, if you mention anything beyond that, you are in spoiler city.
Yeah, because the trailers for the movie have done a very deliberate bit of deception in that they've kept a major thing out of the trailers, which has meant that the actual publicity for this movie has largely been a bunch of quite random scenes taken from the film, but with no idea of what the genuine plot is. And I think that's because Wanda is the villain, which is meant to be a big twist and surprise. And I really hate it when movies do things like this, which meant that you can't actually talk about them in any kind of significant way without giving away a major plot point that happens early on. I fucking hate it when that happens.
This must be... I've never thought of that. This must be such a nightmare as a film critic. It's like, well, great, now mentioning anything about the film is a spoiler, because 15 minutes in, it's revealed who the villain really is.
Wanda is the villain, and this has very much been, I think, the centre of a lot of the criticisms of the movie, perhaps understandably so. So, did you watch WandaVision at all?
I did. I've seen the entirety of WandaVision, in fact, yeah.
Yeah, I caught up with WandaVision right before this movie. I've been a bit grumpy about the MCU spin-off series because it feels like a lot of work. Like, do I have to watch all of this like several hours long series to understand a movie?
I feel exactly the same, and I'm getting so bloated with Marvel stuff and getting so sort of more superhero stuff. I really don't want to sit through these series, but WandaVision dragged me in because it looked so weird, and indeed it was for most of it.
Yeah, WandaVision is genuinely good. I quite enjoyed WandaVision. Admittedly, it does suffer from some issues that I think end up becoming problems into Doctor Strange, and then other issues with the show I think are problems that affect how we see Wanda in Doctor Strange. But I quite enjoyed WandaVision as the kind of pastiche of sitcoms that it was, but it eventually developed into a darker edge. I do have to admit that when it got into more traditional Marvel territory, I was kind of losing my way a little bit with WandaVision a little bit. I kind of liked the more sitcom-y side of it than the more traditional Marvel side of it. But otherwise, I thought it was really well done, actually, and gave a lot of room and character development for Wanda. And Elizabeth Olsen is great in the role. She's been pretty much great the entire time she's been playing it, but it was nice to see her actually take centre stage for a change.
Yeah, because very little was done with the character beforehand, really, was it? She was just sort of there and did a couple of superhero bits and was sad when her brother died, and that was pretty much it. So it was nice to now have an entire series to actually sort of get into the character, and in the weirdest way possible.
The thing about WandaVision that I think is obviously quite complex is the fact that it's based around the idea that Wanda, in her grief, envelops this entire town under her control. And so the whole series is kind of wrestling with her being hero or villain, and that's kind of been Wanda's entire thing ever since she was introduced in Age of Ultron. Man, that movie feels so long ago, I almost forgot the title. But yes, Age of Ultron, and then in her appearances since then, she's been a very conflicted character. Obviously, she's tried to do the hero thing in Civil War that ended up resulting in the Sokovia Accords.
Yep.
So,
whoops.
Yeah, whoops. Accidentally blew up a whole building full of people. In Infinity War and Endgame, Vision dies, so she's had a pretty rotten run of things. So WandaVision, I think, expanded the character as sort of a hero, sort of a villain. She doesn't feel like she's entirely control of her abilities, because WandaVision portrays her at least as an empathetic character, because she is still sort of the hero of that series. There is an antagonist for her to face off against. It still kind of felt like she was kind of the arguable hero of that series, so it does feel like a little bit of a surprise in Doctor Strange that she ends up being the villain.
I think WandaVision sets it up sort of physically but not emotionally.
Yes.
I mean, at the end of WandaVision, she is literally in that orchard, in that hut, and like wandering along looking at the blossoms. Then you see secretly there's a more sort of, or a part of her or whatever, or her real form is literally floating in the air reading this book, and all the stuff's going on.
Yeah,
Like,
the
she's
Witch
up
form,
to something. Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And which they directly take on from this. I mean, Strange goes to see her, and it turns out the orchard isn't real, and blah, 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 blah.
It's the big post-credit scene for the series, which I have to admit, I saw that post-credit scene and just went, I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah, we've kind of got her answer now, but yeah. But as you correctly say, she's been fighting sort of, she's been doing this evil stuff, but then at the end of WandaVision, it feels like, okay, she's realised what she's done, she's got some sort of self-awareness that, oh god, this was actually really bad, and I was playing the villain. I'm supposed to be, this mother figure, but is that the way you're supposed to act? But now the kids have gone because they weren't real, and you don't know what she's up to. Oh, and it turns out she's so desperate for magic kids to be real, she's going to basically destroy everything and kill everyone until she can get in a multiverse or another universe where they are real.
Yeah, it feels like we have massively missed a step here somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. She's gone from like, oh, bad. Well, yeah, okay. Bit of self-awareness. Okay. Oh, it turns out, nope, it's completely the opposite. I'm a mental monster. Whooply. I don't know. It's a bit, as you say, it feels like we've missed a step. I think that's exactly right.
So there is, of course, the Darkhold. She attains the power of the Darkhold at the end of WandaVision, and that's sort of implied to have corrupted her. The problem is that so much of that happened off screen, obviously for the sake of surprise. It just feels a little bit jarring, because where WandaVision ended, it didn't feel like it was kind of going in that direction, and there wasn't enough hints that it was going strictly that way. And then suddenly Wanda turns up, and she's done being reasonable, as she puts it, and just basically annihilates everyone.
Yeah, and that apparently is still her being reasonable, because now she's sort of powered to god levels or something, which that's becoming increasingly a problem with the Marvel films, isn't it, where everything has to be bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't know, I'd like perhaps a more tightly focused story, but like the entire universe or the entire multiverse has got to explode in every film, and they've got to stop it exploding, and suddenly everybody's powers are so crazy you can't really tell what they can do and what they can't. Which is, I think, is a problem through Doctor Strange, because sometimes the wizards seem almost sort of godlike in their powers, then other times you can sort of hit them and they fall over.
Yeah.
And I don't really have a idea of where their power levels are at.
Yeah, the limitations feel a bit flexible on the demands of what any given scene requires.
So yeah, that's exactly correct.
There are a lot of action sequences that involve characters doing lots of hand gestures and CGI accompaniments, but are very hard to describe what's actually happening on screen.
Yes. I mean, you get some great sequences as well, like when he's fighting the sort of heartbroken, dark home, slightly evil Doctor Strange, and they start pulling musical notes out of script music, and you get the music as part of it, and it's a very imaginative and very impressive. I mean, what they're doing, I haven't got a clue, but it looked great. And I really enjoyed it, But then he kills him just by kind of knocking him out of a window. You're like, couldn't he have stopped falling?
Yeah, again, it kind of is the demands of any given scene, the power levels. So,
yeah.
See, I didn't mind her being the villain, because in many ways that's kind of full circle, because obviously she was introduced in Age of Ultron as an antagonist, and then at the end of that movie kind of moved back round to the Avengers. So it's kind of fitting that she's come back round to being the villain. And I think a lot of viewers have kind of had this kind of stumbling block, especially because I came in so fresh from WandaVision. I was literally watching it up to the day of actually seeing the movie, so it very much was a continuation in that literal direct way. And then it feels maybe slightly regressive in terms of the characterization. It does, because obviously you've had 9 episodes to kind of get close to Wanda as the forefront of that series, and then it does feel very strange to have her as this killing machine.
Yeah.
Because that's literally what she is. Like, after a certain point, after she attacks Carmitage, she literally, that is all that she does. She, like, anyone stands in her way, death, death.
She ain't messing around. She wants her pretend kids to be real, or to be somewhere where the pretend kids are real. I think a better way of describing it. But yeah, I mean, that Carmitage scene, which is all the, like, Earth sort of super sorcerer types, and, you know, all the really strong ones, and all the trainees, everybody's there. And she's just like, you explode now.
Yeah.
You know, they really can't stop her. I mean, they do the whole thing of in movies, oh, she's too powerful, we can't stop her, but they're not lying in this one. She really does, just literally lays waste to it.
Yeah, just annihilates them, just absolutely decimates the entire lot. Even later on in the movie with the Illuminati, I mean, the Illuminati were meant to have stopped Thanos in that reality, and then she just cuts through them like a knife through butter.
So this Illuminati thing is interesting. They're basically kind of a version of the Avengers in another universe, but they're more of a sort of overseeing council of sort of clever people. And it's all, to be honest, feels a little bit fan servicey.
Yeah.
Because you've got John Krasinski as a version of Mr. Fantastic. Will he be Mr. Fantastic in the film? I don't know.
Yes, I believe that is the plan.
Ah, good. But the last I heard of the Fantastic Four film, the director had dropped out.
Yes. The director had dropped out days before this movie came out.
Oh God, it was that soon. Okay.
No, John Watts, who had directed the 3 previous Spider-Man films, who I presume had a moment where he woke up one morning and went, hang on, I've directed 3 massive Marvel films back to back and I'm currently on my 4th. What the hell am I doing?
Please, I need sleep. I just want to make a film about, I don't know, a sheep with a hat on. Like something easy. You know?
Yeah, just need a little rest from the Marvel machine maybe at some point.
You've got Agent Carter from the Agent Carter What If stuff, where she's Super Soldier Carter or whatever. Trying to think also. There was a version of Baron Mordo, of course.
Oh, Lashana Lynch as an alternate version of Captain Marvel.
Oh, yes, of course.
I forgot that she was in that movie to begin with, because I do have to admit, I don't go back and rewatch a lot of Marvel films, because they come out so regularly that I don't really have the thought of going, oh, I want to go back to that one. Not usually, anyway, but...
No, I fully understand that.
Yeah. Anson Mount, who is reprising his role from the Inhuman series, but this time he actually has a comics faithful version of his costume.
Yeah, I was genuinely surprised at how faithful. I mean, I've not seen the series he's from, but I've seen sort of the design, and it felt very much like we're leaning away from the comic book, but they really lent into the comic book on this one. He's like the most comic booky looking of almost any of the Marvel characters, I think, in his way.
And of course, Patrick Stewart turns up as Professor X.
Literally comes on the screen. They play the opening bars from the 90s X-Men cartoon series in the soundtrack, which is like, I was like, oh, that's a bit much, isn't it? I feel like I'm being pandered to now, and I don't like that.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of fan service, you know.
The whole Illuminati bit of the film is probably the bit I actually have the most problems with on a story level, because it feels like the movie stops for that whole section of the movie.
Yes.
Well, actually, the whole Mordo bit in general, that middle act of the movie is kind of where I feel like the most story problems happen. The film feels like a bit of a war in some ways. There's stuff that Raimi wants to do, and then there's obviously the MCU stuff that he's required to do. And the movie kind of feels like it's a little bit in between those two stools. But yeah, as you say, it does feel egregiously fan servicey. And this is what I hate about the So obviously multiverse things really come into their own in terms of being told on screen. I mean, you only have to look at Spider-Man No Way Home, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which still hasn't opened in the UK yet, so we can't compare it to that. But
I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, I am looking forward to it. But, we're having all these multiverse stories. And the problem with these that I found is that a lot of fans just basically use these as excuses to go, hey, it's that character. Hey, it's that character. And that's the thing I hate most about these stories. It's like, it's not, like, if you use those plots intelligently, you can do kind of interesting theming and things like that. A lot of fans just kind of use it as an excuse for tired old mystery box mechanics. Like, there's no reason for a lot of these characters to be there other than, MCU fans will recognise them, and that was kind of my problem here. Like, you could tell a version of this movie where it was just one exposition character in place of about 5 Illuminati members.
Yeah, because they all just get massacred by the Scarlet Witch, with the exception of Mordo, because he's staying behind to keep an eye on Strange,
Yes. And then he's just out of the movie anyway.
Yes, that's entirely true. And it doesn't really mean anything, because he's not the Mordo from our universe.
Yes, that's kind of the problem with the alternate universe stuff as well, is that obviously when you're introducing multiverse and things like that, it adds additional wrinkles in the fact that these are not the same incarnations of the characters that we previously know, but it also means we can bring actors back and things like that, so it is a bit of a loophole. And so the whole Mordo thing strikes me as a bit of a weird missed opportunity here, because obviously Chiwetel Ejiofor has not returned as Mordo since the first movie.
Yeah, exactly like the Christine character. They've just not been mentioned.
Yeah, and the first movie kind of ended on a note where he was going to be the bad guy next time, and then that obviously didn't really happen. So he's kind of back here, but he's not back because that's not the same version as in Doctor Strange. This is the 838 version of it. So a lot of Multiverse of Madness is set in the 838 universe, whereas the main MCU canon is 616. So this Mordo is a different Mordo who initially seems to be on Doctor Strange's side and seems like he has a more charitable relationship with him, but he's capturing him for the Illuminati to, I guess, try. And it's a bit of a weird thing because Mordo doesn't actually do anything really in the grand scheme of the story.
No, it absolutely just brings him over,
There's a weird couple of lines of dialogue where Strange goes, Mordo, he's tried to kill me in the past. And you go, when did that happen? That's not happened in the MCU.
And he describes him as if he's some sort of, this is the guy, and he desperately wants me dead. It's like, it's not really how it happened. He basically said, look, you've got incredible power, way beyond anybody else as far as we can tell, and I don't trust you with it. And he's got good reason not to trust him with it, because again, super spoilers, it turns out at the end of the film he's caused incursions between universes and God knows what, because he's always pissing around. Look, the whole plot of Spider-Man is Doctor Strange using his powers irresponsibly and nearly bringing an end to everything, so Mordo, #Mordo was right.
They keep implying that Mordo is villainous, but it sounds like a thing where if you read the comic books, that makes sense. But in terms of screen adaptations, they hadn't actually got to that stage yet.
No. And the whole Illuminati are entirely reasonable, but are using exactly the same reasoning as our version of Mordo did. They're like, we find the problem with Doctor Strange is they keep trying to blow up the universes, so we tend to kill them. It's like, okay. Yeah.
It just feels like it stops because, as you say, it's a chase movie overall. It's a chase between dimensions. But it feels like the movie has to stop for all this stuff. And what I felt like, for the most part, that section with the Illuminati was basically, here's some coming attractions, especially in the case of Reed Richards' appearance.
Yeah, and also, is it fan bait as well? Because, like, Patrick Stewart appears, there he is in his super wheelchair, blah, blah, blah. He's not going to be Professor X again, is he? It's going to be somebody younger, or they might use James McAvoy, or I'd be very surprised because he's, A, incredibly advanced in age now, and B, doing Picard.
Yes.
So I very much doubt when they sort of bring the X-Men into it in full, because we've only really had hints of them in this and in the Deadpool films, haven't we?
It feels like Stewart's appearance is a kind of backdoor way of having the X-Men universe incorporated into the MCU. Like, it's in the MCU, but it's an alternate reality MCU. Like, that feels like it's the kind of hand wave.
That's exactly. So whenever we at Disney acquire a new property, we can just slot it in because it was yet another universe, you know. Which is beginning to feel a little bit like nothing really has a consequence. I mean, does it matter if a character dies if you've got literally an infinite number of almost identical backups?
Yes. Is it like that Jet Li movie, The One, where someone goes through alternate universes and kills off the other versions? Do their power get divided between the alternate universes?
That's what it is, yes. The thing about the America Chavez character is she's apparently the only one who can go through the multiverses because there's only one version of her. She doesn't exist in any other universe, which would make her death actually mean something, but everyone else's is now a little bit... I don't know.
The whole multiverse stuff, it does add complications to the existing plot line, and I have read some people say that the movie feels convoluted or they couldn't follow it. I don't really strictly agree with that. If you just break it down into very simple terms, it's not actually that complicated. It just feels that complicated because there is so much stuff happening, and I just keep calling it stuff because it is stuff. It's not really essential for you to understand, but it is stuff that you need to kind of remember in some ways. Like, it's the kind of combination of all this stuff setting up the multiverse, or the MCU history that you have to remember, and then of course you've got the alternate dimension stuff, and I feel like the Illuminati stuff is a step too far in that regard. That's why the movie feels like it's a bit much. Is like, if you got rid of all that stuff, it would be much more easy to follow, because it feels like the movie just kind of stops for that stuff, and if you don't really know who these characters are, it just kind of feels a bit like a weird detour in the entire movie. The film could have benefited from having a third less in it to give the remaining 2/3 a bit more room to actually breathe and be clarified.
I think you're spot on there. I mean, I saw the film with my girlfriend, and she's not aware of Mr. Fantastic or, the ones who haven't had films, obviously. Or, well, I know there have been Fantastic Four films, but why
not
would
this
she have
version?
Yeah, exactly. She's very lucky to have never seen Fant Four Stick or whatever it's called.
God.
But it's just another room full of weird people. But kind of in the plot, that's it, because everything else that actually you know about Mr. Fantastic you have got from entirely different properties. You've read it in comics, you've seen different films. It's not something that's in this film, you know. So, as you say, the Illuminati is a bit of just a sort of drop of, here's some fan service and maybe setting up casting for the future, and there you go.
One thing I did think was very weird about the kind of Reed Richards thing is that there is a very brief passing line of dialogue where Strange says, "Oh, you were big in the 60s. And I go, hang on, is that an indication that the Fantastic Four Marvel film is going to be a period piece? Because I think that divides reception in the fan base a little bit.
I think that was just a joke saying that the Fantastic Four sounds like the Beatles. The Four. Yeah. But there is also, I suppose, the other layer of that of, I mean, the comic was big in the 60s.
Yeah.
So I'd love to see a Marvel period piece, though. That would be nice.
They have done it, but for the 90s, which, let's face it, we're a bit less nostalgic for.
Yeah, that didn't quite... I need, give me 50 years or so,
Yeah, we've had 90s, and we've had, obviously, 1940s and 30s with the first Captain America movie, but otherwise, it's all been relatively contemporary.
As well. What was the 90s one? I'm trying to think now.
Captain Marvel.
X-Men had a thing. Oh my god, I'd forgotten it was even set in the 90s. That's how much of the 90s they used. They were all on spaceships and stuff.
There's a couple of moments where Captain Marvel crash lands in a blockbuster video and stuff like that, and obviously Nick Fury's a younger version of himself, but otherwise, the fact that it's the 90s is largely incidental to the movie.
Yeah, I totally feel. Yeah, of course, there's the blockbuster, because you've got the Samuel L. Jackson de-aging. The other problem is, I've now seen so many Marvel movies, they are beginning to coalesce into one Marvel blob in my mind, I think.
Yes, that I do find that to be a problem. Sometimes I will watch a Marvel thing and not realise that it's actually calling back. Like, as I mentioned, Lashana Lynch, she was in Captain Marvel, but I couldn't remember that fact until I looked it up. It was a bit of a surprise to see her pop up, because obviously I more know her for her appearance in No Time to Die, rather than Captain Marvel.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fair point. It's so hard to... You almost need like some sort of massive board or something with all... like in a conspiracy film, where you've got loads of bits of red string connecting films to other films and stuff. Yeah.
I mentioned the whole kind of Marvel backstory thing. It does feel like there's a lot of weight of that here, in the fact that obviously Wanda's arc has been across several films over an 8-year span now. And a lot of the stuff revolves around Infinity War, which was 4 years ago now. So that's all kind of, ancient history as far as recent blockbusters goes, but there are still major events that are referenced in this movie. Part of the reason why Wanda is so pissed off in this movie is because on some level she does blame Doctor Strange for what happened at the end of Infinity War, in the fact that he gave up the Time Stone, and that gave Thanos the ability to rewind time. So the fact that she had to kill her lover in the form of Vision, that sacrifice is instantly undone so that Thanos can just do the deed himself. And so Wanda is really quite angry at that, but I feel like it's one of those things that's brought up in dialogue, but it's not really given enough thrust in the narrative. It's there if you remember that plot point, but not really given enough clarification.
It's almost, I think it is literally one line, isn't it, if I remember?
You would think that would be kind of a major deal in the movie, especially because the film, I think on some level, is attempting to wrestle with the idea of Doctor Strange's actions and their consequences, therefore. Because obviously you've got the alternate versions of Strange, who are different kind of warped versions of him, but they each share the characteristic of being, on some level, selfish and taking single-minded decisions, usually at the detriment of others. So, of course, at the beginning of the movie, you have the supreme version of Strange. I don't know comic books very well, but I've got the notes ready for this. But so the version of Strange at the beginning of the movie, who tries to sacrifice America and steal her powers, that's from the Supreme timeline of the comics. And then, of course, later you've got the Darkhold version of him, who is a similarly warped version that has allowed his entire universe to be destroyed, largely. And, of course, you've got the 838 version of Strange, who caused an incursion in another universe and then had to be destroyed by the Illuminati. So there is this entire kind of recurring idea that Strange is a very selfish person, and a dangerous one at that.
His whole thing is he's so uncompromising, isn't he? He cannot compromise, which is what actually kills the relationship with Christine, apparently, in every bloody universe, as far as we can tell. They're never going to be compatible because he cannot give an inch, ever. In fact, he says as much, doesn't he?
Yes. His heart wants Christine, but he can't have her because they just don't work out. They are, on some level, just fundamentally incompatible with each other. I did like that Rachel McAdams did actually have a fairly substantial role in the film, because I genuinely thought she was only going to be in it for a cameo at the start of the movie.
Oh, I felt the same. Yeah, no, that was pleasing that that is the sort of emotional core of it for Strange going through us. Because when I saw the scene at the wedding at the start, I thought, this is just going to be gone and that'll be that, won't it? But no, they did a much better job than I expected. So, yeah, I salute that.
Yeah, they bring in the 838 version of her, which is a sort of a professor version of that character. She's studying multiverses, and she gets to be actually in the movie for a bit, which is a nice thing to have, because Rachel McAdams is a very solid performer. I kind of like having her be around in these movies, at least for a little bit. I'm pretty sure this is the exit for that character, because obviously that's meant to kind of resolve that plot line at very, very long last. But even so, nice that they actually gave her something to do, because I was almost certain they weren't. Especially because they bring back Michael Stuhlbarg, who was apparently in the first Doctor Strange. Don't remember that. But he was in the first one. But he's got very prominent billing for appearing in one scene at the start of the movie.
Yes. as a very strange man, let's put it that way. Not in the... Oh, God, you can't use the word strange when talking about this film. He's not Doctor Strange. He's not a version of Doctor Strange.
See, the original Doctor Strange movie, from what I remember of it, because, again, I didn't revisit it for this this movie. It's been way too long and I have far too many movies to watch. But I remember liking the first Doctor Strange, but I thought that it felt like a fairly standard MCU origin story, particularly because it hewed so closely to Iron Man's arc. And I do feel like at times Strange kind of veers very close to Tony Stark territory, kind of in that same sort of way.
Yeah, arrogant man who's always right. Yeah. And has a beard. Oh, that's probably not that relevant, but
It does feel like he's almost become a de facto replacement for Robert Downey Jr. now that he's out of the franchise.
Yeah, there is a bit of that, isn't there? And let's face it, by the time Iron Man died, he was probably more of a wizard than Doctor Strange was. Fixing time travel in 2 seconds. He's making invisible suits that come out of nowhere and then they're full entire suit of bloody super armour. I hate that in these films, that sort of ultra-compressive technology of, you can't see Spider-Man's suit, but it's all in this button, and he pushes it. In fact, that's not even an exaggeration, that's literally what happens. And suddenly he's got a massive suit of armour over him.
He's literally got nanotechnology.
Yeah, this now feels magic, doesn't it? It's the old Arthur C. Clarke thing of sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That was it. I think they'd kind of ruined the Tony Stark character so much by the end of it because he was so ludicrously perfect at everything and super intelligent, and it just felt like, I don't know, it just felt sort of barely even a character anymore,
I think in the final two movies they did actually finally give him a little bit of something to do, but it definitely felt like in the later appearances Tony Stark was more kind of plot device, and he would invent the solution to the problem. I quite enjoy Benedict Cumberbatch's performance as Doctor Strange, although admittedly I don't think it's particularly a huge stretch for him. It's definitely the sort of character that usually gravitates towards that kind of egotistical person. That's kind of been Benedict Cumberbatch's kind of standard MO for characters ever since Sherlock. So I don't think it's really a stretch for him. But it's nice that he does bring a bit of credibility to the kind of whole hand-wavy thing, which could come across as being very silly, let's be honest.
Yeah, that's something you've really got to dedicate yourself to, that, because if you don't believe it, the audience isn't going to believe it. It's literally you just waving your hands. So if you feel even slightly embarrassed by that, it's going to come through in your performance. But no, Cumberbatch is a very solid pair of hands, I think, and he handles the sort of levity of it quite well as well.
Yeah, I feel like he has fun playing the alternate versions. I do wish that he got a bit more time playing those versions of those characters to give them a little bit more kind of distinctive personality, particularly the kind of Darkhold version, which is the one that we perhaps spent the most alternate time with. He definitely kind of leans into the kind of campier aspects of kind of playing this really over-the-top, exaggerated mirror image of Doctor Strange.
That's an interesting one. And from what I saw of the trailers, I kind of assumed he was going to be the bad guy.
That's the way they'd edited the trailers to air around Wanda.
Exactly so. But no, there's not much of him left, really. He's got it's the weird thing of, if you use the Darkhold, you seem to get stained fingers. That seemed to be actually the main side effect of it. So that was my big takeaway.
That and the eye thing.
Yes, the third eye. To be fair, Wanda didn't get the third eye, though, unless she was hiding it under the tiara or something. But he's kind of broken, isn't he, really? The Darkhold and events have kind of broken him more than giving him sort of mega powers or something, which is an interesting way of dealing with it.
Yeah, he's just this self-destructive version of the character that has been entirely poisoned, and he's just to such an extent that his entire world is literally destroying itself outside the window.
Yeah.
He's kind of resigned himself to that. It's kind of Strange's most self-destructive personality traits just taken entire form of itself, because obviously the main 616 version of Strange is arguably the best version of Strange there can be, who is still a very flawed person, and then he meets this Darkhold version of him, who is the most flawed version of him that there can possibly be.
This whole multiverse thing is such an odd one, because if you've got an infinite number of them, then there's going to be an infinite number of slightly offset ones, isn't there? So, I don't know, you've got a universe where, I don't know, Doctor Strange is actually a film star. That could come into it. And his films are 3 hours of him forging checks. And everyone thinks it's great and get all excited when he gets the signature wrong. This is the problem when you start looking at infinite universes. The ones we see are very similar to the main character, but sort of have gone off slightly. But you could go in such an extreme direction that this version of Doctor Strange is actually 2 cups with a cherry on top, and it's sentient, and it flies around and does matter. This is... Well, actually, they give you an example. They even reference it later of when they're going through the universe, and there's one where everything is made of paint.
Yes.
And when you can go to that extreme, you've got a lot of stuff you can potentially bring in, and versions of characters which would be so mad you can't sort of get your head around it, which I suppose opens up lots of opportunities for later, but also equally, as we were saying earlier, means, does anything have that much weight?
It's kind of the thing with time travel stories. Time travel stories require a lot of kind of very weird mechanics that are kind of hard for the audience to wrap their head around. And I feel like multiverse stories kind of have the same thing, where they need to have these kind of exaggerated things and then put it into a rational kind of story for the audience to understand. And I do feel like calling it Multiverse of Madness is kind of an exaggeration to a certain extent, because there isn't that much dimension hopping, and I was kind of surprised that there wasn't kind of more playing around with the most exaggerated versions of it. And maybe that's just a limitation of the fact that this is live action, because obviously what kicked off this trend was Into the Spider-Verse, and that had a pig version of Spider-Man in it and things like that. But can you do that in a live action space? I don't know, but certainly this movie didn't really test that, because we spend the most time in 616 and 838, and 838 is not really all that dissimilar from our reality, except there's more flowers on the buildings and people cross the street on red instead of green, which is not exactly the most exciting changes in reality.
And Bruce Campbell will sell you pizza balls.
Yes. I did like Bruce Campbell popping up. Of course he did. It's a Sam Raimi movie. But, yeah, kind of... I think that's an Evil Dead 2 reference, isn't it? Because he just basically beats himself up, which is kind of the recurring gag in that movie.
Yes, his hand goes evil, isn't it? Yeah.
I did kind of find it funny that that's the post-credits bit at the very, very end of it. Just him doing an almost Ferris Bueller gag of just him turning to the camera going, "It's over!"
That was so pointless. I kind of enjoyed it, especially because I'd had to wait through all the credits.
Yes,
I was doing the podcast. So we've got to see the whole thing. I wouldn't normally have waited for that. I've just read about it afterwards. But it's like, yep, I think I've been slightly played there, and that's fair enough. You did it well. I
was slightly disappointed that they didn't have Bruce Campbell as maybe something a bit more imaginative than a pizza seller on a street, but yeah, what can you do?
That's very cameo, isn't it?
Yeah, again, going back to the whole thing of, well, infinite possibilities, infinite cameos, but then again, what would be the benefit of doing infinite cameos? It's the kind of thing where people were suggesting the 70s version of Doctor Strange from the old TV movie. I don't think that can happen for license issues, because that's still with Universal, but Dr. Mordred, I mean, you could do that stuff if it weren't for the whole copyright shenanigans of it. But again, to what end? What would be the benefit of doing those things, I suppose?
That's a really weird form of fan service for fans of Full Moon Pictures. Yeah. Is it Full Moon? Dr.
Yeah,
Mordred,
it was Full Moon.
Because I can't imagine you would have to offer them, is it Charles Band or whatever, that much money to license Dr. Mordred.
He would gladly take that money.
Yes. And then make 14 other Lovecraft adaptations. Yes.
Yeah, he'd be like, "Oh, you're offering me how much? Okay, I can make 16 Ginger Dead movies."
Yeah, 3 Doll Man and at least 12 demonic toys. It's going to be great. Where's that castle I bought? It's going to be in all of them. Something I couldn't quite get my head around with this multiverse hopping is, when they move from one universe to another, they seem to become what the version of them in that universe would be. So like when they're in the paint dimension, they're made of paint. When they're in the animated dimension, they're animated. So surely then, if they went to, this slightly... Was it Earth 838, isn't it?
Yeah.
If they go there, would their clothes have then been more Earth 8380? But no, they're exactly the same as where they came from. It's only the visually interesting ones that make them change.
The movie seems a bit hesitant with the kind of multiverse stuff, in I guess the same way that the original Doctor Strange movie kind of felt a little bit hesitant with the whole kind of mirror universe thing that I still don't think they've entirely used to their fullest advantage in the live action stuff, even though I did think the fight scene in No Way Home with him and Spider-Man was probably one of the more visually interesting aspects of the movie. The whole kind of multiverse thing, it does feel like that they're making sure, okay, we have to keep this relatively straightforward to make sure that the audience are mostly on board with this. I'd imagine that's why I didn't go through loads of costume changes, or they didn't try to do anything really ambitious, even though I do think that is kind of a minor disappointment with the movie, that they didn't try to be a little bit more daring and experimental with it in some regards. I mean, there are some bits that are a bit different for the MCU. We'll get into that later, but otherwise it does feel largely business as usual for the most part.
Yeah, it doesn't, as you said earlier, it doesn't quite add up to the Multiverse of Madness title.
What I will say is that that in terms of getting the continuity from previous movies in and previous series, I do think that on some level, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness kind of works as a standalone thing, in that you don't have to watch loads and loads of stuff to understand it. Like, you have to have obviously seen Infinity War and Endgame and WandaVision, but it's not as bad as it could have been, because I was definitely hearing rumours like, oh, you have to watch Loki, which of course delves into some of this other stuff, and maybe Loki will turn up in it, and thank goodness he didn't. But, you know, it is a point that keeps coming up. I do think that at this point in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we have kind of caught up with the comic books, in that the comic books have a problem with the fact that their continuity is so dense that it becomes very isolating to newcomers to actually step inside of it. And I think we're at the point in the MCU where a similar problem is occurring, where there is so much backstory for everything now, there isn't really an entry point anymore, especially for casual fans who are, let's be honest, not going to retain this stuff. I know there are really big fans of the MCU, but most people don't carry a walking encyclopedia of plot points from the previous Marvel films. I've watched all of these, well, most of these movies. I've still not caught up with Eternals yet, but there are still things that I kind of completely forget about, because I'm human after all.
I think you're spot on there. I was thinking about this after Spider-Man No Way Home. It was a great film, really enjoyed it, really good sort of emotional weight to it. So imagine in the future, you're 10, 15 years down the line, and somebody says, oh, those superhero films, they were big, weren't they? You know, a kid or something. Go, oh yeah, you should watch them. Tell you what, you should watch Spider-Man No Way Home. Great film. Oh, the emotion, it's just really good. Oh, wait. But before you watch that, you're going to have to watch the first Spider-Man film. Oh, and then for that Spider-Man film to have made sense, you'll have had to have watched a couple of the Iron Man films. You're going to have to watch Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, really. And the first one's pretty bad and the second one's awful. So you're going to have to... Oh, yeah, and actually, you're going to have to watch the original Spider-Man film. That's all right. Spider-Man 2, that was good. Yeah, watch that. Avoid the third one. And suddenly, you've got a list of like 10 or 11 films you have to watch to actually get the full emotional weight out of No Way Home. And a lot of those films aren't very good. So in order to enjoy a good film, you have to watch like 4 really bad ones, 3 okay ones, and 4 good ones. And,
I can tell you right now, by the way, that is literally the exact circumstance I had with my friend Alison Pregler, who does movie nights, because she's not really invested in the MCU. She was kind of turned off with the fact that it requires so much laborious backstory to get through.
Fair enough.
But she wanted to see No Way Home, and I explained to her, you really do have to have watched every Spider-Man movie that has come out in the last 20 years to understand it. So she ended up having to do a marathon run. I think she skipped the Avengers movies, but she did end up having to watch the Amazing Spider-Man films as well. So she did like a massive marathon catch-up session. She kind of enjoyed Homecoming, but she hated Far From Home, much like I did actually, because it was so reliant on the Iron Man stuff. Like, she's like, piss off, Iron Man. I'm not here for that.
No.
I mean, it's kind of interesting that this is the next Marvel movie after No Way Home, because the movie does very briefly reference No Way Home, but doesn't actually kind of really reference it. Like, it's a passing line of dialogue, like, oh, there was a multiverse thing with Spider-Man. Who's Spider-Man? Which kind of feels like a bit of an inside joke to the fact that, of course, Raimi directed the original Spider-Man films, but again, it's interesting because if they wanted to, they could have really tied it up with the events of No Way Home. And I thought that Multiverse of Madness was going to be running on from what had been previously established in that movie, because obviously Doctor Strange opens the multiverse in that. So you would think, oh, well, they're kind of punishing him for opening the multiverse, but actually they're not. It's just like a separate thing.
No, I made the same assumption.
I mean, that would make more sense on a plot level if you were thinking of this as a continuing story arc, but I think that's partly because there's been so much kind of rejigging of the kind of timeline because of COVID and other circumstances. It does feel like a slightly odd thing, but again, I guess if you're keeping this as streamlined as it has to be, then that's the kind of thing that you don't really expand upon.
That's exactly it. I assumed it would be back off the Spider-Man multiverse stuff, obviously, because, I mean, it sort of fits, doesn't it? And it's kind of a shame they don't for continuity in that, but ultimately I fully understand why, because that would be another film you had to watch to understand this one. And that is a film, as we were just saying, you have to have watched God knows how many films beforehand to understand.
Exactly.
So, you know, they would have made it literally impossible for anyone who isn't invested in the MCU to have made sense of the film, you know, so I totally get it.
There is a very weird example of the streamlining in that Wanda is in the movie, but makes very little mention of Vision in terms of her motivation.
Yeah.
Which is odd, because
he's
obviously...
mentioned, but that's it.
Yeah, he is mentioned in the movie, but it's largely about her kids. Like, that's her main priority. So, and it just feels very strange, because obviously, if we're coming right off the back of WandaVision, where Vision was a primary character, it feels very strange that he's not really prominent here, or really given too much of a mention. And I have seen Elizabeth Olsen kind of hand-wave this in interviews, like, oh, well, she's more focused on the children, but it does feel really odd, because she invented an entire other version of Vision out of her pain, and also, there is now another version of Vision floating around for Paul Bettany to come back in as a result of WandaVision, so I was expecting that to pop back in at some point, but nope.
The thing here is it goes back to a problem with multiverses. So she's, oh God, she needs these kids, and she's been corrupted by the evil book, and they're going to get these kids and do whatever. And she's got access, or is trying to get access to an infinite number of universes. Surely she could just now go to a universe where not only the kids are real, but Vision is still there.
And Vision never turns up in this alternate reality. No explanation. No explanation for why he's not there.
No, none whatsoever. I mean, presumably it's the same things happened with Thanos, but they kind of didn't, because the Illuminati beat him in this universe. Let's not think too much about that.
Yeah. Again, streamlining, they bring the kids back from WandaVision, but they're not the same kids from WandaVision. They're an alternate version. They're the 838 versions who actually do exist in this incarnation, and Wanda is the housewife she's always wanted to be.
And she could have it all. She could genuinely have Vision there as well. There's no reason why not. There's an infinite number of universes. But for some reason, well, probably not for some reason, it is for simplicity, and I do get it. He is hand-waved out of it, but ultimately maybe that is a good thing, though, because it does cut down on the complexity and the number of things you had to have watched.
See, this goes back around to the discussion I was having at the start about Wanda, because I do feel like the arc in the movie as presented really simplifies her as a character, and I think this is why this has kind of rubbed people the wrong way. It's not the fact that she's the villain. That, I think, works perfectly fine, is perfectly understandable. The problem is that I think the way that she's characterised in the movie is reductive in some ways, in that this whole idea of, oh, she wanted to be a mother, but she can't, oh, she's going to kill everyone for the sake of her kids and wants to be a housewife, that's kind of trading in some very regressive ideas, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad you've said this. It's left a bit of a taste in my mouth as well. You have got this whole, mums be crazy sort of thing where, they'll do anything and they've got no logic when it comes to their kids. No, this isn't... It seems like you're feeding off that a bit. And also, it's just something about having the really powerful female character, but then, she's gone mad because of her feelings.
Yeah.
And, they defeat her because of her feelings when she becomes, a bit self-aware and takes responsibility and stuff. She was made evil by her feelings, but she was also defeated by her feelings. I don't know, when you've got a female character especially in a genre which doesn't have that many big, powerful female characters, at least not until that recently. It may be I'm being overly sensitive there, but it just made... I don't know.
There is something kind of retrograde about it. It was just kind of in the back of my head, like, I don't know about this. In trying to simplify it, they've got rid of a lot of the nuance that was in that character. And I think full credit to Elizabeth Olsen, who I think elevates that performance. She is fantastic and terrifying in the movie. But coming off the back of WandaVision, where they gave her the room to actually flesh that character out, it actually feels like it does a bit of a detriment to this movie, because now that we've had that development, it feels largely a bit for naught. Like she kind of becomes a bit one note in this movie.
And that's not going to be good for people as well who are thinking, oh, do I really need to watch all these Marvel series? Well, I mean, you can, and it gives you a bit of backstory, but they apparently don't mean anything when it comes to the films, really, because it's just bing, and everything's different. Is that going to put people off watching them?
Like, it's the same kind of thing with Dark Phoenix. Like, Dark Phoenix and Jean Grey and all that stuff. Very kind of similar territory. I know that a lot of similar criticisms have been lobbed at that kind of stuff. These kind of storylines and that they've taken inspiration from the comics from, they do seem like they are kind of, in some ways, products of that kind of era where there was that kind of thinking.
This has just occurred to me that if you actually reduce the Scarlet Witch's character down, she's basically one of the most powerful beings in the universe, but all she really wants to do is be a housewife.
Yes, exactly. That's the thing.
That had never occurred to me till now. That's like the absolute vein of WandaVision and even this film.
She wants to literally become a sitcom wife.
Yeah, in the 50s.
Like,
I mean, you could argue she just wants the sort of modern version of it, and that was a regression, blah, blah, but ultimately that seems to be the motivation.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a criticism that many people have actually bothered to address, but that does, that was kind of nagging in my head, especially because Suicide Squad, the first one, they did a similar bit of bullshit with Harley Quinn, where, we're never going to be those people that presses the on-off switch on a dryer or something like that, and then she has that weird fantasy sequence where she imagines herself and the Joker as being husband and wife, and there was a lot of criticism of that sort of stuff. I don't see that same sort of criticism being lobbed here for some reason, but it's similar kind of ideas that I just go, okay.
This is what every woman wants. Spoilers, no it isn't.
No. It's like every woman wants to be a mother, and they'll kill if they aren't.
God, I hadn't even gone that far. Oh, no.
See, but yeah, when you boil it down, it is kind of that, isn't it?
Oh man, yeah, that's sweeping a broad brush there, isn't it?
It's a broad brush, but kind of true.
Oh, yeah.
This is going to be really super popular. I can tell the comment section are going to love this.
Oh my god, yeah.
What I will say, though, is that, as I keep saying, Elizabeth Olsen genuinely works really well in the villain role. Questionable writing aside from that sort of stuff. Again, there are kind of interesting things about the way that Wanda is characterised and her relationship with the other characters. There was an interesting point Darren Booney brought up on Twitter in response to some of the criticisms about the way that Wanda is characterised. He feels that the film knows exactly what it's doing. Quote, by the opening of the movie, Wanda has made no atonement for the events of WandaVision, is living so openly that Strange can easily find her. He knows she enslaved an entire town, but shrugs it off and promises to get her back on the lunchbox. Quote. And I suppose that's an interesting idea. The initial idea that Strange turns to her because she's an Avenger, and kind of hand waves off like, oh, I don't care what happened in Westview or whatever. You're an Avenger, so you're on my side, which is a bad assumption, and of course his first big mistake in the entire...
Doesn't last long, that assumption, does it?
No. Not even to the end of that scene.
No, literally.
Wanda is trusted even though she shouldn't be because she's an Avenger, and I think that's an interesting idea, but I don't think that entirely negates a lot of the criticisms, because I don't think the movie really delves into that after the initial introduction. Like, after the first few scenes, she's just all bad pretty much until the end of the movie. She is a straightforward foe to kind of run away from. Like, she is so bloomin' powerful. Literally run.
Yeah, and just becomes more of a threat as it goes on, really, as she abandons her reasonableness entirely,
She goes up against a bunch of heroes and just kills them all in the most horrifying manner.
Again, you've got this weird thing of not knowing where the power's done, because she kills Mr. Fantastic, the Illuminati version. why did I say the Illuminati version? There is no other version in the MCU. By just like splitting his body into pieces and then literally bursts his head. Like,
folds him in on himself or something. Yeah,
yeah, it's really gross. But then the other ones, she kind of fights.
Yeah,
it's like if she can just split somebody apart like that, shouldn't she have just done that on the others, as opposed to, having to have a bit of a fight with Carter and, splitting her in half with a shield and stuff? Spoilers.
Hand wavy dark hold.
Yeah, but obviously it's there to provide, exciting scenes and, make the film exciting, which I fully understand. But maybe don't have a bit then where she can just kill somebody with no effort.
Yeah.
And there's no fight involved,
Yeah, there is a certain point where she becomes so powerful, she just literally just starts decimating everyone in her way, and then it just doesn't stop until the end of the movie. And I do think that this is the exit for that character. I know, Multiverse, she could come back and everything, but I don't.
Yeah, we also don't see the body.
No, we don't see the body.
She also survives pretty much as bad stuff as all that stuff collapsing on her earlier, in the tunnels with the water and stuff. But has she allowed it to happen to herself? We don't know, do we?
Yeah.
No idea. It logically makes sense to end the character there, though, I agree.
Yeah, because there is no way you can bring at least that version of the character back and have her be the hero, given that she has literally killed about 100 people.
Oh, yeah, but now she's got the self-awareness, and she's realised that the reason she couldn't have what she wanted is because of what she'd become, you see? Yes. No, I think you're probably right, to be honest.
Yeah. It definitely felt to me like an exit storyline, which fair dues. I just feel really conflicted about the Wanda stuff, and I know I'm definitely not alone in that. I feel like they could have handled this a little bit better than they did. The movie loses a bit of nuance about it, and I think this strikes upon the main problem that I had with the movie, even while I was watching it, is that obviously I'd come right off the back of watching WandaVision, as I mentioned earlier. And WandaVision gives you that time for character development and room to kind of breathe. This movie doesn't really have that. It's a chase movie for the most part, and it's largely action sequence, action sequence, action sequence, and I would have probably found it a little bit better if they just given a few pauses to actually expand out the characters, because they do feel like they largely are there to fulfill their roles in the plot. And so you do have these kind of themes that are built up. And this kind of idea that, Doctor Strange is inherently egotistical when he has to kind of wrestle around with the consequences of his actions, both of himself and his alternate selves. But also this idea that, Wanda she feels like she's owed something in some way, like she's owed this family, she's owed this kind of happiness that she's chasing for herself, even if she's doing it to the utmost extreme and it's kind of poisoned her in some way. But it does feel like the characterizations, they don't expand too far beyond that.
Yeah, as we said earlier, the America Chavez character is so sort of minor. It is almost like narrator and MacGuffin, and that's pretty much it. Which is such a shame. Yeah,
Xochitl Gomez is good in the role. I enjoyed her performance, but in terms of actually being a character with agency and things to do, she is largely there as a plot device. She is there to get Strange to other worlds. I mean, it's telling that in that Illuminati section of the movie, she just spends the entire time in a plexiglass cell.
Oh, yes. Yeah, she literally, yeah, right, she's not in this bit. Literally. Yeah. It's such a shame because the performance is great. The character's very likeable. I would really like to have known more about the world she came from as well.
Yes, because that's just in an offhand flashbacky bit.
Yeah, she's got two mothers. And you're like, oh, is that just the way things happened? Or is that the way that world works? Is that the way that world works biologically? We don't know. Oh, why are they wearing these weird uniforms with the star clasp? What does America mean where she comes from? Is it the country? Does it mean something else? That's why she's called. There's all these sort of little interesting things built up, and don't know.
Yeah.
It's not mentioned or covered. It's literally, as you say, just a little throwaway sequence to give her a bit of a sad backstory, and I'd really like to have known more about it, especially because it's the one universe that seems to have a unique person in it. So that's interesting as well.
I do feel like Gomez has a lot of room to kind of expand on that character in the future. I think she shows a lot of potential as she kind of grows into that role. But I do feel like the movie underserves her in not really giving her enough backstory to fill her in properly. And also, there is the fact that that character is a major LGBTQ character in the Marvel Universe, and aside from that flashback with the two mothers and the fact that she wears a pin, that's largely just not in this movie for the most part, which is another criticism I've seen lobbed that is very valid.
This has just reminded me of something. It's just such a minor thing, but isn't it a terrible idea in it's Earth 838, isn't it? You can just be walking down the street and stop outside a shop and suddenly it will show you from your mind some incredibly emotionally affecting memory of yours.
Yes.
And show it to you in the third person. Just while you're walking down the street, stop outside a cafe.
Yeah.
And other people can see it. Because Doctor Strange could see hers, couldn't he? And vice versa.
Could. She could see his and he could see hers. And so the whole thing is that, like, these incredibly intense personal memories are literally being projected in front of people.
This is horrifying. Like somebody walking down the street and suddenly you're walking along to what's happening over there. Oh, it's just somebody's memory of being horribly beaten by their drunk father when they were a child. What the bloody hell? What if the memory's sexual? You can't have it's such a ridiculous idea, that sort of bizarre holodeck thing they've shoehorned in as a way to get a bit of backstory and show it to you visually. But it's such a ridiculous idea.
Okay, we need to do this thing, but let's do it in a really strange way. to pun.
In a way that has no sense to it.
It's one of those things where you go, surely there is a more organic way of bringing across this information between these two characters.
In this universe, for God's sake, don't stop outside a cafe, is what we're telling you.
Surely you could find a way of, like, Doctor Strange finding a way of maybe entering into her memories or something like that. I mean, I guess that's kind of going into kind of Professor X territory, in that he literally does that later in this movie. Hand wavy, it could make sense. He can do most things.
This is an odd question, but the whole Professor X going into, the mind of Scarlet Witch, blah, blah, blah. Did you find the first part of that really funny?
Which part of it?
Especially the start, because when Professor X sort of goes, oh, and into mind, he sort of goes, oi, like that. Yeah. It's sort of almost anime, sort of, oi, way like that. It made me laugh. And then suddenly he's wandering around in a black polo neck on a sort of a white soundstage. I think it was off the hui point.
Yeah.
But it just really amused me. It then gets very not funny quickly, because they do a very good job of making the Scarlet Witch come in and be more powerful than him and literally snap his neck, and that's very creepily done. But just that little bit at the start.
Some of the later X-Men movies did kind of play around with the idea that, he's in, like, this kind of mind space. Like, there's a whole bit in Apocalypse
absolutely a thing.
where he has a fight scene in a version of the X-Mansion, but it's entirely in his head. But again, it kind of feels like that stuff didn't really work on a visual level very well, at least coherently. And I feel like this little tiny bit kind of feels a little bit jarring, because that's not really been too much of a thing in previous X-Men films.
And not at all in the MCU films. So there's no...
There's
nothing there to set it up. Yeah. So, for instance, at the start, it becomes very obvious quickly he's gone into her mind. But right at the start, it's like, oh, hang on, is she controlling this white thing? Is this in her mind? Because, of course, then I'm thinking, oh, no, it's like the old X-Men films. And he's, okay.
Yeah.
But I don't know how that would have read to somebody who hadn't seen the old X-Men films, actually.
I do think it was quite striking on a visual level, but again, it's one of those sequences that in isolation it works really well, but it does stop the movie for about 2 or 3 minutes to kill off Patrick Stewart.
Who a character with no introduction in the film. Or that film universe.
Yeah, the assumed introduction of, you've seen the X-Men films already.
Yes, or at very least you've seen a poster. You'll be fine. Yeah.
I do get people being very sniffy at me for making that criticism, like, oh, the MCU films are getting so convoluted that you need to have this entire working knowledge of them. They don't work as standalone movies. And I guess understandably there is the counter-criticism of, well, of course, it's an ongoing franchise, but even so, I do think it's such a massive franchise that they're isolated films as themselves. They can't entirely work on your knowledge of previous things that have happened in other movies. They need to work in their own isolation. I feel like this movie is kind of the embodiment of that problem, which I kind of worried was going to be the thing with No Way Home, actually, because I knew that they were going to be bringing in, obviously, those previous incarnations into the sort of Tom Holland timeline, as it were. And I was worried, like, oh, this is going to become a real mess. But actually, the messy stuff is kind of in this movie more than anything. Whereas I think No Way Home did a good job of at least tethering that to an emotional arc, whereas I feel like this film doesn't quite entirely succeed at that. I'm aware that I am sounding very negative on this because, despite the fact that I enjoyed it, but it's only because there is so many things where you can just kind of point at stuff and just go, I'm not sure about that. I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. I felt very conflicted while I was watching it, and I'm aware that I am different from a lot of viewers in that I very much blow hot and cold on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in that sometimes I can really hate installments like Far From Home, and then I'll like the next one, like No Way Home. But, I feel like that's because I view them from movie to movie, not as an ongoing thing. I view them as bits themselves.
I think we're on the same sort of level on that, yeah. And I'm now beginning to feel a bit oversaturated by it. I certainly won't be watching any more of the TV stuff. Even the Loki stuff sounds quite interesting, but it's just, I need to take a step back from a lot of the superhero stuff, or I'm going to get sick of the films. Yeah. And there's bound to be a couple of like really, really good films coming up, and I don't want to have them spoiled for me just because I'm oversaturated with the whole bloody concept of it,
I am aware that the next Captain Marvel movie that's out next year is linked to some of the TV stuff again, so it is going to be required viewing in some capacity. So you're not going to get out of that requirement, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm not going to. I'll have to read the Cliff's notes on that one. It's the soap opera effect, basically, they're going for, isn't it? Where people feel, I can't miss any of the Marvel stuff because, I want to stand next to. I've got to keep up with it all the time. I've got to watch EastEnders every day. I've got to watch all the TV shows and have my Disney Plus subscription. I've got to go to the cinema to see all the films, and I've got to keep feeding the franchise, or I won't be able to keep up with it. I won't enjoy it as much. But it does then create the problem, as you say, of where's the jumping on point for new people or young people who are getting into it. I feel they do a better job with it than they are doing with the Star Wars stuff, because the Star Wars now, so much of Star Wars at the moment just feels like an advert for another bit of Star Wars, which then feels like an advert for another bit of Star Wars. Nothing exists in its own right. Everything is just an advert for something else. Where is the thing that you're advertising ultimately?
Disney has really leaned into what the MCU has done, but has applied it to other franchises like Star Wars. And I've got to the point where I was so disappointed with Rise of Skywalker, I've not even taken a second glance at any of the TV stuff. And the TV stuff kind of feels like extended universe now. And that's sort of the same way I've been treating the MCU stuff. But now it's becoming a bit essential. It's like, the obligation of having to keep up with it. That's what it will eventually
becomes a job.
Yeah, it will eventually tire people out. Because the sheer quantity and weight of it means that it feels like you're running a constant treadmill of having to keep abreast of everything that's going on in it. After a certain point, they do have to lean away from this angle of putting everything together to make these movies feel a bit more like something that people can actually kind of just jump onto, especially if we're changing the guard now at this point, if we're changing who is really the front runners of the MCU, there needs to be a certain point where we can go, that's the end of that. This is where the new people come on, the next generation for these movies. And I feel like that's the question in the future. Like, if we're bringing in all these much younger characters now, like Miss Marvel, Miss America, and things like that, if we're bringing in those people, we need to have a point where the viewers that those movies are aimed at, and TV shows, they need to have a point where they can go, okay, this stuff is in the past now. It's the same thing with Doctor Who. Doctor Who doesn't need to have, like, a huge recurring knowledge of its continuity, because every time it does a regeneration, that's kind of an entity unto itself. It's a different bit of the show.
Yeah, and you'll get nothing more than harkbacks, really, as opposed to, if you haven't seen all of Peter Capaldi, you can't watch Jodie Whittaker. It doesn't really work like that, does it? You're right.
The MCU needs to adopt that line of thinking at some point or another, because otherwise it's going to royally bite them in the arse. One thing we haven't actually mentioned yet is obviously a very big part of this movie, Sam Raimi.
Yeah, and his horror predilections.
Yeah, because the original Doctor Strange movie was helmed by Scott Derrickson, who helmed Sinister, and I believe at a certain point a few years ago, originally the idea that he was going to do the sequel, and then that kind of changed because he kind of felt that what him and Marvel wanted to do were kind of different, so he jumped off to do his separate movie. He's done a movie called The Black Phone with Ethan Hawke. Sam Raimi jumping on is interesting for a number of reasons, because first of all, it's the first film that he's helmed in almost a decade, because the last film that he made was Oz the Great and Powerful, which...
I saw that at the cinema. What is wrong with me? Oh.
I saw that at the cinema. 2013 was a different time, okay?
I can't believe, still to this day, that Sam Raimi made that. I'm sure there was an evil ultimate multiverse version of Sam Raimi making that film, or something just went hideously wrong. I don't know.
It did feel like Sam Raimi kind of chewed up by the Disney machine, which is ironic because he comes back with a movie made by Marvel or some division of Disney.
Yeah, true.
The thing that I did like about this movie is that it did feel like a Sam Raimi movie, at least in some respects, especially with regards to the direction. Again, going back to how some people feel online about this movie, the direction does appear to be a bit of a dividing point, in that some people have suggested that they were quite annoyed by the camera work, to which I would suggest watching more Sam Raimi films.
Yeah, I like the camera work. The sort of, you've got some of the odd pans and zooms and the odd angles. It's a film about crazy wizards and mad multiverses. That's absolutely justified. You know?
It's very visually dynamic. It feels very comic booky, and that's completely understandable because Sam Raimi loves his comic books. He's no stranger to the superhero genre. He made Darkman before superhero movies were even really a thing.
Yes.
Then he made the entire Spider-Man trilogy. In some ways, it feels like he's kind of this old school director coming back to the new school, and there is a lot of stuff that is very pleasingly and identifiably Raimi, especially in that opening fight scene against the big sort of tentacle monster, and later on in the finale.
Shumagorath. I think they call it Gigantor or something, don't they? It looks exactly like the way they always portray this character Shumagorath, which was in sort of Marvel fighting games and stuff, but apparently like the rights to it as partly Conan or something, so it's not Shumagorath, everyone.
It's a legally distinct entity, sort of like Dr. Mordred.
Yeah, it's the Dr. Mordred of Doctor Strange villains. Literally is, yeah.
I enjoyed the direction of Raimi. Again, I do feel like it's kind of a bit of a half and half between what Raimi wants to do and what Kevin Feige wants to do. But even so, I do think that when it is most identifiably Raimi, that's actually where the movie is at its strongest, especially because it feels like it's at its most bonkers. There are bits about it that are very identifiably him, especially because there's so many kind of callbacks to kind of Evil Dead or Drag Me to Hell. There's literally a Drag Me to Hell moment where one character gets sucked into hell, which, by Marvel film standards, it is fairly extreme, but it feels like it's still a part of that world, and I did quite enjoy the zombie strange finish.
That was lovely. It's nice that Sam Raimi's back, but they've let him bring his bag of horror tricks with him this time, and he can't go right to the bottom. It's still got to be, something the kids can watch. But if it's a kid who's easily scared or is a bit upset by things, you ain't going to be taking them to see this film. It does have some proper dark imagery. You've got horrible spooky demon ghosts. Literally, as you say, Doctor Strange is physically a zombie for like the end of the film, and a particularly not like a grotesque bloated corpse or something. It's very much Hollywood zombie, but still, part of the mouth's missing and it's all a bit rotten. And
it's all decomposing.
I think the scariest thing is probably the Scarlet Witch, though, when she really goes for it.
Yeah.
And when they give her that kind of horror edge where she'll suddenly appear out of nowhere and snap bloody Professor X's neck, I can understand kids being very frightened of it.
There is a lot of moments with Scarlet Witch that are just genuine horror territory. I really liked the moment. The CGI's a bit wobbly in this moment, but I enjoyed the idea that is very kind of Ring-esque, where they trap her in the mirror dimension, but she keeps popping out through reflections, and then eventually she kind of distorts her way through the gong at the end of the room.
Yes, the reflection of the gong, and she's all like, the arms and legs are broken. She has to snap them quickly back into place, as if travelling through the mirror has, physically broken her.
Like I said, CGI a bit wobbly in that moment. There are a couple of instances where I think the CGI isn't quite up to the par we'd usually expect from these movies, but I really liked that image despite that fact. It has what I would describe as kind of having a slapstick ghoulishness about it, very Evil Dead 2 in some ways, where you mentioned the kind of musical notes battle, where they're literally doing notes from, I think it's Snow White at one point. It's that kind of Three Stooges-esque kind of exaggeration, comic edge to make them palatable for an MCU audience.
And the horror stuff felt very in place. It didn't feel like you were lurching between, fun comic book, light-hearted stuff. Suddenly it's awful. Suddenly it's nice again. It all felt, all part of a cohesive whole, which is quite a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
It's impressive. It does a better job of that than I think Shazam, which, I liked Shazam, but the horror monsters in that kind of feel like another part, almost from another film or something, and it kind of, the tone varies wildly when they're in, whereas this is more even. It feels more sort of organically constructed.
Yeah, it feels more one than Shazam did, because Shazam kind of felt like a family-friendly movie, apart from when the horror movie director did the horror movie stuff.
Yeah, that's literally it, yeah.
I think Raimi has a lot of experience with that, because he did that a lot in the Spider-Man movies. I mean, there is that famous surgery room sequence in Spider-Man 2, a movie which in the UK was given a PG certificate.
Yes, yeah.
What helps is that a lot of the violence in the movie is extremely fantastical. It's not even remotely realistic what's going on, which adds to that cartoony sensibility about it, but also it doesn't feel like it's realistic in any real way. It's not like people are stabbing each other. It feels visceral in an impactful way because it's surprising, but in terms of visual detail, it's just relatively discreet. I mean, in a PG-13 horror movie, of which there are plenty, it feels right at home in that sort of thing. The only thing I was thinking while I was watching it was going, this is treading very close to the borderline of where is a movie a 15 certificate and where is a 12A certificate in the UK, because obviously a lot of PG-13 horror movies are 15 certificates over here because the horror elements kind of tipping them over.
I was just trying to think of the more sort of visceral death, so to speak. It's the neck snap, I suppose, is the most realistic in the sense of that there's no, it's not a realistic thing to do, but there's no sort of CGI or anything on that bit, is it? She comes out of nowhere and it's a physical attack.
Bulk's head exploding.
That's exactly what I was going to say, yes. Basically, she removes Black Bolt's mouth as he can disintegrate people with his voice. In fact, I think he doesn't have any control over it. And as a result, he tries to talk when he's got no mouth, and it's just head bursts out the back.
Yeah, I have no mouth, and now I must scream and blow my own head off.
Yeah. And it's kind of the same thing happens to Mr. Fantastic. His head pops at the end, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Agent Carter's, I suppose, is the most extreme of,
she gets bisected, but there's no visual detail, really.
This is it. It's all implied.
Yeah,
yep,
there's a bit of blood on the shield. Yeah. That's the most amount of gore.
And then you see her go, and fall over, but you don't see her from, like, anywhere near the wound.
And in that whole sequence, of course, Wanda is covered in what looks like blood, but is actually black oil from the Ultron robots that the Illuminati use. It's that kind of... It's not blood, it's oil kind of working around that they do all the time in these movies.
But it does kind of just look like very dark blood in certain scenes. It works. It works very well.
Yeah. The other moment that really felt very Raimi-ish to me was obviously the whole stuff with alternate Wanda and the kind of possession angle. It's kind of interesting that we see that sequence from the main universe Wanda point of view, where she's literally a spirit in this household trying to attack this alternate version of Wanda. That is probably the most kind of domestic and realistic the kind of fantasy threat in the movie ever takes. It's that kind of moment that probably would have tipped it. That and the bit where the Darkhold Doctor Strange gets impaled on the fence.
Yes, I'd forgotten that. Yes, of course. Yeah, falls out the window and does not land well.
Yeah, that is the sort of moment where it kind of gets a little bit close to... I don't know if this was 12A or 15. I can definitely tell this was a kind of like a borderline call in some respects. And it was kind of interesting because when I saw the movie there, I was sat in front of two fairly young girls that were probably like 8 or 10 years old at the most. It was kind of interesting to see their reactions, because I kind of thought as I was walking, I'm not sure, parent, that you've kind of appreciated what film this is gonna be.
Yeah, because, why would you as well? Because there's been so many Marvel films and they're all of a similar tone, aren't they? So I can fully understand a parent just assuming it's going to be the same.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting seeing the response to the kind of horror stuff, because I don't really think it's all that dissimilar to some other Marvel entries. I mean, obviously, James Gunn, another horror filmmaker, made Guardians of the Galaxy. Those occasionally have some quite squishy moments in them. There is some horrible moments in Infinity War, a movie where half the universe gets killed at the end of it.
But in a very antiseptic way.
Yeah, yes. But it's not like Marvel films don't have a precedent for occasionally getting a little bit dark.
I think it's the fact that it's a part of the core of this film, isn't it? Not only is there a lot more of it, but it's kind of the tone of it too. But I think you're right. The only thing that could be proper upsetting, I think, for the general children are when the Scarlet Witch is in the house after them, because at other times it's happening in some sort of crazy big building or some insane other dimension, and there's no real aspect to it. But now there's literally 2 kids in their house where they live with
terrified
what the Scarlet Witch has become, smashing their mum up.
Yeah,
I can understand the BBFC raising an eyebrow at that one, put it that way.
There were a couple of little moments where I did hear some audible reactions from behind me when the creature at the start gets its eye ripped out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the first moment that parent might have had a little bit of a regret bringing quite so young kids in there. But I do remember just hearing a ew right from behind me.
Because that is something that would have had a discretion shot before, wouldn't it? You would have seen the thing going towards the eye, and then it would have cut away, and and then you'd have seen the thing collapse. But no, you see it go in the eye, and the eye be torn out and go flying off.
See, it's not a human, so you can be super graphic with it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
The other moment was, of course, the head bursting scene almost I did have to avoid laughing at that moment, because literally when he crashed onto the ground, the girl went, ew. Just that perfect way of timing.
She's not wrong.
Yeah. The whole content of Doctor Strange has caused this weird controversy that I think was started by Variety's film critic of all people.
Oh?
Normally, when I hear about these kind of MCU controversies, which aren't actually controversies, then it's normally me going, someone who's very young, who hasn't really seen a lot of movies, and so the fact that this MCU movie is doing something a little bit different kind of feels a bit alienating. Whereas this, it was actually started off by a film critic going, I think this movie should be R-rated. And you go, no, not really. There is precedent for this.
If that is R-rated, an awful lot of things would become R-rated.
Yeah.
Why on earth would you... No, that seems ridiculous to me.
It's kind of a tougher movie by MCU standards, but MCU movies are not usually topping the end of PG-13 territory, and there are a lot of PG-13 comic book movies that trade in exactly the same kind of territory as this did. I was thinking of the Del Toro Hellboy movies, very similar to this. Days of Future Past, similar in content in terms of annihilating characters in horrible ways.
Yeah. I suppose the thing they're complaining about ultimately is there's not much precedent for it in the MCU, and I suppose they're thinking, if the parents have seen all these films that are all similar tone, there should have been big warnings on this one that it's darker or something. But to say it should be R-rated is ludicrous.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely ludicrous.
I mean, it's almost on the same level as Morbius, which did get a 15 certificate a few weeks ago. Of course, the difference is that this movie actually got a controversy because people saw it.
Yeah.
Again, kind of PG-13 horror-influenced superhero movie, kind of tripped a little bit over the edge into 15, but only just about. So it's very much kind of like a knife edge with that sort of thing. But I think that Raimi knows what he's doing. I mean, this is the guy that made the famous video nasty Evil Dead. He could push it if he really wanted to.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was one of his first films, for God's sake. He knows where he's coming from.
But again, I think it's interesting that we are seeing a lot of horror-influenced superhero films in recent memory. The genre's always kind of been a little bit adjacent to that. There's always been kind of like body horror elements and things like that, but it feels like there's more of a kind of push into that with things like New Mutants and Morbius and so on and so forth. I would be interested to see what Scott Derrickson wanted to do with Doctor Strange. It's not like they kind of went away from that when they did this movie, but I'd imagine it would have been executed in a very different way.
Is it this thing of superhero films are just becoming all the films? There's horror superhero films. There's comedy superhero films. Action superhero. Are we going to have a romance superhero film before too long?
That would be interesting. I would be interested to see if someone actually tackled that, because I do think we're kind of seeing a bit of rom-com return after being a genre that no one has touched for years on end, because they turned awful at some point. You know, horror's having a real resurgence right now. I think that rom-com could be the next big genre resurgence, and if that happens, we could end up seeing that. I can't think of a lot of superhero rom-coms, aside from My Super Ex-Girlfriend. Who wants to remember that movie?
Ooh. Ooh, nasty. Really nasty. I mean, I suppose you could argue there are a lot of rom-com elements in WandaVision, but they're kind of there for a very specific reason. It's not played simply, shall we say.
That sort of romantic chemistry has always been part of like several superhero movies, but it would be interesting to see it really pushed into the forefront.
Let's just hope we can still have films that aren't superhero films, that still get a decent amount of budget behind them. You know, we don't want everything to become that.
I think it's very important to say that if you don't like MCU movies, there are plenty of other movies that are not MCU or DC movies that do exist. Please watch and support those movies. They are going through a little bit of a tough time, instead of spending all your time ranting about how Marvel is poisoning the entire world, which might have some valid criticism behind it, but mostly seems like a way of just shitting on people for liking superhero films.
They like films I don't. Therefore, I must say the films are bad. I mean, none of these, even if you pick your least favourite of the MCU films, none of them are ever badly made. And they always shine on performance. It's so rare you get even like an average performance in an MCU film. They're so on it. You know, the actors are always good. I'm sure the director's on it. And everybody puts the work in. When you've got something as inherently daft as the sort of superhero and superpower stuff, you've got to really commit to it to make it work. So maybe that helps matters. But the fact remains, they're always of a decent standard. You're never going to go watch an MCU film and come out thinking, that was absolutely abysmal. Oh, the effects didn't work.
They've never reached that point for me. Not yet, anyway. But certainly the MCU has been very consistent in terms of quality, at the very least. I mean, there are obviously ones that are better than others, but I do think that sometimes the detractors do like to imagine that every single MCU movie is, say, Thor: The Dark World, which that's not really true.
That's my least favourite. That is my least favourite of them. Although I should point out, I haven't seen The Eternals, so...
Far From Home is my least favourite currently. I just thought that did so much damage to Spider-Man as a character, because it really leaned into the Iron Man stuff, and I just thought, didn't like that.
I kind of felt like that with Homecoming. Because he spends half the film moping about because he can't talk to Tony Stark.
But even I would say that, you know, Far From Home, it's still like a competently well-made movie. I just think that it has story problems, but on a technical level. Like, it's still, like, leagues above the disasters like Fan Force Stick and things like that. So, yeah.
God.
But yeah, this whole idea that Marvel movies are anonymous and things like that's not really true. You look at movies that are, say, directed by James Gunn, Sam Raimi. The Russos definitely added a kind of vibe to several of their Captain America and later Avengers movies. Yes, there are some MCU filmmakers that are a bit more workmanlike, like John Watts. I don't think he added a particularly visual flair to the Spider-Man movies, and maybe that might be something they want to do going forward. But even so, I do think that the MCU has largely, by and large, been fairly successful as a creative endeavour, and I feel like there is still potential in this universe. I just think that they need to rein in all this crazy super linking of everything, because otherwise it's just gonna become this huge weight on these movies. I've kind of been saying this on and off. I kind of feel like, you know, like Wile E. Coyote as he looks up to see the shadow of something that's about to crush him.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's the creation of this universe, the interlinking, which has got everyone invested. And they're fully aware of that, and they're doubling down, blah, blah, blah. And it's been incredibly successful and continues to be incredibly successful. But if they're not careful, it will reach a point where there's too much of it, people will get a bit sick, and because everything is intertwined, suddenly they're sick of everything.
Yes.
You know, they won't be placated by saying, hey, next film's a Taika Waititi one, it's going to be funnier, it's going to be more imaginative, blah, blah, blah. Oh, no, I can't be doing with it, no.
Again, Taika Waititi, another MCU director who actually put his own stamp on the material. So, yeah.
That's the thing, isn't it? If somebody's, all these MCU films are the same, right, well, show them Multiverse of Madness and show them Ragnarok and say, right, which one of these was directed by Taika Waititi? If they're all the same, you won't be able to tell.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you bloody will immediately.
There is undeniably a house style, but there is also definitely room for directors to leave their own stamp most of the time.
Yes.
So, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. So, where can people find you?
Just Google Ashens, Ashens.
If you want to support my channel, you can do so with my Ko-fi page or with YouTube's brand new Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. You can now tip me in the comments. Woo! Or if you can give me a little bit more long-term support, you can do so on Patreon, where you can see my videos early, among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.